your world news headquarters on the World Wide Web. It's time for your daily dose of sanity. This is the Meria Heller Show. Meria Heller is a published author, founder of the Universal Wheel, a lifestyle and philosophy based on our interconnectedness to all living things, a Reiki master, and delivers the news with spiritual views. How many intuitive news decoders, animal rights activists, and vegetarian broadcasters are there? Just one, Meria. Meria has provided independent news for a smart audience for over 13 years now on the Meria Heller Show, available at Meria.net. Meria.net. And now, here is your host, the mouth that roars, Meria Heller.
Good morning, world. Meria here, alive and kicking. How's everybody doing out there? Welcome to another episode of Roaring Truth with my excellent co-host, Professor Jim Fetzer. Good morning, Jim.
Oh, good morning, Maria. There's been so much going on, you hardly know where to start.
Oh, I do know that for sure. But I have to tell you what little action I have left that I can actually put up on my Facebook after getting slammed off there 8 days ago. About our shows together. People are giving us great compliments and just loving our work together. So my hat's off to you, Jim.
Well, Maria, it's such a pleasure working with you, but you're telling me that Facebook is scrubbing your site. That's shocking, and I think it reveals how the intel agencies are taking a larger role in relation to the social media. They're trying to constrain communication between members of the public and investigators, students, researchers, persons like you and me. I mean, I may have mentioned before how my Wikipedia entry was butchered. They took out more than half of what I had there, all the important scientific, forensic, probative information about both the assassination of JFK and the events of 9/11. Well, I published about it so anyone could check the difference for themselves in an article entitled James Henry Fetzer, Wikipedia Not, where I included the original, Maria, and then put in red all the parts they'd taken out. And I find that on Google, where I have hundreds of interviews and, stuff, Hannity and Combs, O'Reilly, presentations I've given on JFK, 9/11, Wellstone, they have gone through, and every couple of pages they've inserted a whole bunch of blanks, making it look like there isn't any more. I looked just the other day, and after about 2 pages and a half, you found about 6 pages of blanks suggesting there wasn't more, and then there was more, and then a host of more blanks. I mean, this is getting very, very nasty, Maria. I think First Amendment, was tattered and torn, but now it has appeared they're outrightly suppressing our freedom of speech.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it makes me glad that I started out with my own site, my own independent show, and still have it. Because this way I have final control over it until, of course, they find another way to shut down everybody's websites, too, which I'm sure they're working on.
Well, I'm sorry to say, I mean, that's the tendency. That's the way things are trending. And I don't expect to see any relinquishment anytime soon. They're not suddenly going to declare that this really is a United States of America. We really do have freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It's all going the other way. Absolutely.
I'm sure you've been paying attention to this election process that's going on. I don't know if you got to see the first debate or not. But looking
absolutely. I wouldn't miss an event like that, and I couldn't believe the outrageous behavior of Romney. It's as Obama said, a man came on the stage and said he was Mitt Romney, but he couldn't have been Mitt Romney because everything he said contradicted what the real Mitt Romney had been saying for the previous 18 months.
Well, there's so many things. I got to tell you, first of all, I thought that moderator sucked.
Yeah.
And if you remember when we were in Virginia together at that conference, I moderated, I think, 6 different panels. And nobody ever got away from me. I never let them, take over the way that Lair, he just sat there like the deer in the headlights look.
Well, and it was even worse because of his questions were so vapid, nebulous, open-ended. I mean, he could have asked any number of very nice, pointed questions, for example, about Romney's dismissal of the 47%. Mm-hmm. Which increasingly looks like the number that the Republicans are trying to plant in the public consciousness when they attempt to steal the election, I predict. that if it goes forward, in spite of the fact that Romney is demonstrating he's completely incompetent to be president of the United States every day, in every way, he shows more convincing evidence that he has no idea what would be entailed by being president of the United States, that they're going to give 47% to Obama and claim, you see, all along they knew. That was the hardcore of Obama supporters. It's outrageous.
I'm sure you saw that his wife came out and said that she's worried about his mental well-being if he becomes president.
And Romney seems to be worried about his mental well-being even now. Maybe she realizes how seemingly schizophrenic he appears when one day he's lambasting, Obamacare. The next day he's taking credit for it because, of course, it was actually modeled after a medical health care program that he himself instituted in Massachusetts. But, denying he's got a $5 trillion tax cut scheme is one of the most bizarre aspects of it, Maria. I mean, economist after economist has drawn the same conclusion. And, he wants to reduce tax rates across the board 20%, which includes the rich. And he claims he's going to compensate for it to make it revenue neutral by abolishing deductions and closing loopholes. But Maria, the only deductions he can be talking about are the standard ones for health insurance, for charitable contributions, and especially the mortgage deduction. Maybe he's even going to go after employee deductions for the use of your automobile. Whatever it is, it's going to be outrageous, Maria, and the American people need to know.
Hey, I totally agree. I mean, I have to tell you, watching him literally does make me pine for the days of George Bush. He makes Bush look like a genius by comparison. And I thought Bush was the biggest idiot God ever created.
Isn't it absurd? And now he's declaring he wants to build 15 new warships a year, including 3 submarines. I mean, this is a massive expenditure, Maria. I mean, he's not only an unbelievable warmonger who was talking about a first strike on Iran when he was competing with Rick Santorum, Rick Perry, Michelle Bachmann, and the other right-wing crazies.
Right.
Only Ron Paul came across as having the semblance of a sane foreign policy, wanting to close our bases, end the wars, and bring our troops home. Mm-hmm. But now he's talking about, defense expenditures that are mind-boggling and beyond anything even the Pentagon itself has imagined in its wildest dreams.
I know, it's really insane. This morning they had an article on Yahoo News that said that more Americans are leaving religion now than ever before. 1 out of 5 has no religious affiliation whatsoever. And this brings us to the elephant in the room that, how come Jim Laird didn't throw this one out? The fact that here we have a Mormon, and he's high up in the Mormon church. He's considered one of their saintly godmen. And the Mormons' goal since they landed in America was to take over the government. And, I don't know about you, but I don't want to live under some sort of theocracy, believing in some weird God from some weird planet that, everybody's going to, inherit a planet after they die. They can make fun of the Muslims with their 21 virgins, but you get your own planet when you're a Mormon. And I'm why is nobody talking about that this guy is a part of a very dangerous cult?
I think that you are exactly right about that. In fact, when he evaded the draft during the Vietnam War era, where his father, George, then the governor of Michigan, sent him off to France after he'd had some kind of breakdown at Stanford in 1966, he spent 2 years and a half there, allegedly doing Mormon missionary work, Maria, getting an exemption from the draft as a minister of religion. But as Gordon Duff has reported and Kevin Barrett has explained, there are several problems here. According to the law, a missionary is not a minister in the first place. In addition, it was illegal to be a Mormon missionary in France at that time. Indeed, Mormonism was defined by French law then as a dangerous cult. No Mormon missionary work was happening in France. The reality appears to be that his very rich and powerful father, the top Mormon in Michigan, illegally shielded him from the draft. And Maria, there's a sequel to this. It may have cost George Romney the presidency. In 1968, Romney was leading Nixon for the Republican nomination and was 10 points ahead in the polls. I remember this at the time. But Nixon's henchmen, remember Ehrlichman and Haldeman, dug up Mitt Romney's draft evasion story and apparently told George that if he took the nomination from Nixon, his son Mitt would be going to prison as a draft evader. Romney bowed out, Nixon took the nomination, and the rest is history, as they say. Maria, I remember at the time thinking it was so strange how Romney seemed to simply disappear from the political scene. It was as though he'd never been there.
Right. Well, kind of reminds you of George Bush's time in the service, when he was in the service and working a job at the same time, which basically was never in the service. And it cost, I'm trying to think of that journalist who brought that out. It cost him his job after all those years.
Well, it was Dan
Rather. There you go.
One who reported the story, and
right.
It was Dan who was the subject of a sting. He had actually verified the fitness report for Bush when he was in the Texas Air National Guard with the commanding officer who had dictated it. He'd gone over it word by word with his secretary who had typed it. But evidently, Karen Hughes and Karl Rove had sanitized the files, discovered the report, and had it retyped. So that when Dan Rather reported it, they claimed immediately, as though anyone would have been in the position to know this had they not actually been involved in the fraud, that it had been typed on a typewriter with a font that didn't exist when it was originally dictated and typed, which led people to infer, well, if the document is a fake, then the contents must be false. It was a very clever ruse.
It's, I tell you, the other thing I wanted to ask you, because maybe maybe I'm misinformed. As far as I know, Mitt Romney's father was born in Mexico. And Romney's got a lot of family in, Chiricahua, Mexico. I've seen some videos online about that, which would make Mittens a first-generation American. I thought you had to be a second-generation American to run for president.
No, all it requires is that you be what's called a natural-born citizen.
Or something Romney doesn't want the illegals to be able to do.
Well, it's very strange, Maria. Given that background, you'd think he'd be far more sympathetic to immigration and to giving lots of opportunities for those in Mexico, for example, who are our most prevalent immigrant population, have the opportunity to come to this country and become citizens given his own history. But, the man is just a massive contradiction. In fact, I'm convinced there's no core. There's no real character that actually defines Mitt Romney, so that, the lampooning that's taking place is perfectly legitimate. I mean, many of us were surprised when Obama didn't take a more aggressive stance in rebutting, but I think, Romney turns out to be the gift that keeps on giving, because they're making endless commercials now, and they're really, I think, striking to the core of this vacuous, empty shell that goes by the name of Mitt Romney.
I forget the first pundit that came out ripping on Romney, and he said something that sounded so true to me. They said he looks like a candidate that was built by IKEA.
That's very funny.
Well, he is very vacuous, but I have to tell you, Jim, on a selfish note, when people are asking me in the street, who's going to win the election, I tell them, well, it'd be very, very, very bad if Romney gets in. However, on a selfish note, I would have a field day with him in power for 4 years. He'd give me more material than W gave me, and I didn't think anybody could do that.
Well, I think it would just be more and more destructive of American culture, American economics, all the values that we hold dear, but which we have been betraying ever since Bush and Cheney entered office in 2001.
Right.
And would you believe, Maria, it turns out now that some of the key players in 9/11, some of those we have identified of having had a role in those atrocities, which were, manufactured by high elements of the American government in collusion with the Mossad, are actually advising Romney. That includes a fellow named Dov Zakheim, who's a joint U.S.-Israeli citizen who was the controller of the Pentagon, meaning he was the chief financial officer at the time when Donald Rumsfeld, the day before 9/11, reported that the Pentagon had lost track of $2.3 trillion.
Right.
Susan Lendauer, who was an asset for the CIA in negotiation with Saddam Hussein and has inside information reports, was actually a much larger number, possibly as great as 9 trillion or even more.
Right.
So, what in the world was going on when he even announced that on a Monday, given that as an experienced politician, he would know that reporters would want to follow it up, and during the week it would, as they say, grow legs and become a very big deal. It was as though he knew something was going to intervene in the meanwhile and obliterate the story from consciousness, so that he'd be able to waltz into the halls of Congress the next day and ask for hundreds of millions more in defense spending, which is exactly what he did. This Zakheim, who actually is a rabbi, believe it or not only appears to have been involved in that massive embezzlement, but also owned a remote control company that provided the kinds of mechanisms that can enable you to overtake an airplane in flight. I believe that the original plan was to use remote control aircraft to hit the North and the South Tower, and that they only had to abandon that plan when they discovered that no real plane could actually enter the tower physically, that it would crumple on impact, wings break off, tail, body, seats, luggage, falling to the ground. It would even explode, actually. They needed to get the plane all the way into the building, Maria, before it exploded, to have the pseudo-explanation that it was the exploding plane and the intense fire from the jet fuel that caused the steel to weaken and brought about the collapse, all of which is complete nonsense and rubbish.
Right.
But there it is. So they had to fake it instead. I've done quite a lot of research on this for those who want to pursue it. If they go to the Vancouver hearings, they can track down my PowerPoint presentation entitled Fraud and Fakery in the official account of 9/11. But also I have a couple articles on Veterans Today, including planes, no planes, and video fakery, discussing how all 4 of the crash sites were fabricated, albeit in different ways. And another very interesting case entitled Reason and Rationality in Public Debate, the case of Rob Basalmo, where Rob Basalmo is the head of pilots for 9/11 Truth that has made brilliant contributions to the study of 9/11, Maria. Most recently, for example, they discovered by studying air-ground communication and radar data that Flight 93 was actually in the air on 9/11, unlike 11 and 77, which weren't even scheduled for flight that day, but that it was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, after it had allegedly crashed in Illinois at Shanksville in Pennsylvania, and that Flight 175 was also in the air that day, but it was over Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, long after it allegedly hit the South Tower.
Right.
So anyone who, wants to understand what really went on 9/11, you're going to have to brace yourself, because this is one of those cases where truth really is stranger than fiction.
Right, and I'd like to let my new listeners know that I've got great interviews with Rob Balsamo and Susan Lindauer in the archives, so don't miss it. Susan Lindauer's book was screaming hot. That's all I can say. Jim, let's get back to Obama the other night. What was he thinking? Maybe Saturday Night Live skit was actually correct, that he was up there sweating the fact that he forgot to buy his wife an anniversary present. Past it.
That was funny, wasn't it?
It was hilarious. It was hilarious.
I've heard far more disturbing rumors, however, Maria, that the election is already rigged, between all these obvious blatant steps involving voter IDs or sending out false notifications of where you're supposed to go to vote or how the procedures are supposed to undertake. And of course, the Republicans own these electronic voting machines. So one source has told me that, in fact, Obama is already aware that he's going to lose the election, and that he's purchased a $35 million home in Hawaii where he's going to retire, and that he's very worried about, the events that are to come, which look to me extremely ominous for the American people.
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, Greg Palast has a great new book out, Billionaires and Ballot Bandits. I'll be interviewing him this month. And Victoria Collier just sent me an article this morning on the voting scam that's happening this time. I didn't get to read it yet, but I will. But I was looking at Obama that night, and I was thinking, if he's trying to take the high road with this moron who kept interrupting, I found Romney to be extremely rude.
Yeah.
Listen, I have a lot of things I'd like to say to Obama myself, but I would still respect him as president of the United States. There was no respect shown on that stage. And, for me, that's, and watching Obama, I was like, man, if he's taking the high road, he's taking the wrong road. He could have slammed him for the 47%, for Bain Capital, for his friendship, and his stupidity, that what he's had to say about Spain, about China. I mean, pissing off the whole world already. And when I read the foreign newspapers, they are terrified of what they consider the crazed Republican Party. I mean, what has become of the Republican Party is almost Neanderthal.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Maria. When I was watching those debates among the candidates, it was just astounding to me. It was really, truly one of those cases where the inmates appeared to be running the asylum. Each one was trying to outdo the other with their enthusiasm for a first strike on Iran, which isn't permissible within the confines of the UN Charter or under international law. Plus, Iran has not attacked any other country for more than 300 years. Iran has signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has disavowed nuclear weapons and has allowed inspectors into its facilities. Compare that with Israel,
right,
which has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has 200 to 600 or more of these little beauties, won't allow inspectors into their facilities.
Mm-hmm.
There's one nation in the country that is a true worldwide menace. That is not Iran.
Right. Well, it's, listen, you got to say, call it the way you see it. My mother used to say, you got to call a spade a spade. Got to look at Israel. I had the privilege of interviewing Mordecai Vanunu twice. And he was the whistleblower on the nuclear reactors and the nuclear facilities at Dimona in Israel. Yeah. And they put that guy in basically solitary confinement for the better part of 23 years.
Isn't that grossly abusive? Similar treatment, of course, was issued out to Susan Lindauer, who wrote a letter to George W. Bush when he learned that he was planning to attack Iraq, explaining how Saddam Hussein was very eager to avoid war with the United States, how he'd offer to buy 1 million cars a year from Detroit for the next 10 years, and that if there weren't enough, make it 20. And after she wrote her letter of protest, she was subjected to harassment, humiliation, intimidation, false imprisonment, forms of torture. It was really grotesque.
Right.
Maria, just imagine where the country would be today if we had not invaded Iraq, if we'd adopted Saddam's proposal and he'd purchased 10 to 20 million cars. I mean, the country would be in a completely different situation economically.
Right, economically, and the world would be at a much more peaceful state. So let's get back to, because you had so much new information in your recent articles, and I'm posting a link here where you can find all of Jim's articles at Veterans Today. You had one article that really, my hair was like, wow, if it wasn't already standing up, it'd be standing up even taller. When you talk about, and we need to talk about, Romney's connections to Netanyahu and the Zionists. Yesterday I had a news story, I don't know if you saw it, Jim, that Romney, one of his big bundlers, this Sheldon Adelson, who's like a worldwide criminal trying to make big deals in China, but China seems to be smart to him. But he also owns now probably the only freestanding newspaper left in Israel. And the Israeli people themselves, not the government, not the Zionists, now have no choice of what they're going to read except Sheldon Adelson's paper in Israel. So we've got to talk about Romney's connections to Netanyahu. And, the sick and twisted, Mormon version of, however, like kind of like the evangelicals, let's all be nice to Israel and Jerusalem until God, Christ comes, and then we're going to kill the rest of those Jews anyway and take it back, which is their plan. I think that it's really important, especially when you talked about Bain Capital, which of course was not mentioned in the debate, Bain Capital owning Clear Channel and all the big loudmouths that are rah-rah sis-boom barring for Romney. And then you even go into something which was that 82-page classified report preparing for a post-Israel Middle East, which I've always known would happen. Okay, I mean, I had a teacher, Jim, who was a visionary, and he wrote a book before he died, and he said, when I look at a future map of the Middle East, it isn't there.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Meria. And, of course, your focus on Sheldon Adelson is very appropriate. I mean, this guy who makes fabulous money in Las Vegas gave $100 million to Romney already, and he is close to Netanyahu and a dedicated Zionist, which turns out to be, a colossal cancer on the international body politic. I mean, if there were one political movement, the annihilation of which would do the world the greatest good, it would be Zionism. And where you mentioned about the Vanunu reporting about the Israeli development of nuclear energy, Ben-Gurion, then the president of Israel, was extraordinarily upset with John F. Kennedy at the time because JFK was opposing the development of nuclear energy or nuclear weapons by Israel. And it may well be that his last act before his retirement as Israel's leader was to assign the Mossad to take steps to get JFK out of office. It appears that James Jesus Angleton, who was, of course, the most influential figure within the CIA, had close ties to Israel, about which I only became well aware when I read Michael Collins Piper's Final Judgment and interviewed him on my own show, because I'm now relatively convinced that behind the scenes, Israel was having an influence, especially on Angleton and by way of Angleton, in setting up the assassination of JFK to remove an obstacle to its development of nuclear weapons, which Lyndon Johnson, once in office, never objected to at all.
Right, more than happy to give it to them. And then, of course, we can always go back to Lyndon Johnson's give to Israel when Israel attacked the USS Liberty. Let's not leave that out.
Oh, that is one of the most shameful acts in all of American history, Maria, to have an American spy ship. It's basically an unarmed vessel, but it's conducting communication surveillance during the Six-Day War to be in the Mediterranean, to be targeted by the Israeli Air Force using unmarked jets, torpedoed and strafed, killing or wounding a couple of hundreds of Americans, and they even were strafing them in their life rafts, Maria, which is, just one more of the war crimes involved here. But to have Lyndon Johnson actually pull the American fighters back when they were going to the aid of the Liberty is, to me, one of the most disgraceful acts in American military presidential history.
Absolutely. And for my listeners, I had interviewed a survivor of the USS Liberty, and the interview is still here on my archives, Phil Turney. So you're going to want to go in and get more education on that. But let's get back to this U.S. preparing for a post-Israel Middle East. I know that they're making it look very much that Obama and Netanyahu are enemies, okay, which I don't buy. But you can't miss that Romney and Netanyahu have to remind you of Bush and Bandar Bush in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Well, the fact is that Franklin Lamb published an article in the Foreign Policy Journal entitled U.S. Preparing for a Post-Israel Middle East, where he included, a dozen great reasons for separating the U.S. from Israel in relation to its foreign policy, including, here are a few, Israel, given its current brutal occupation and belligerence, cannot be salvaged any more than apartheid South Africa could be when, as late as 1987, Israel was the only Western nation that upheld diplomatic ties with South Africa and was the last country to join the international boycott campaign before the regime collapsed. Mm-hmm. The Israeli leadership, with increasing support from the 700,000 settlers in illegal colonies in occupied West Bank, is increasingly out of touch with the political, military, and economic realities of the Middle East. That the post-Labor government Likud coalition is deeply complicit with and influenced by the settlers' political and financial power and will increasingly face domestic civil strife, which the U.S. government should not associate itself with or become involved with. It goes on with more than a dozen really important reasons why the United States foreign policy should benefit the United States interests and not those of this little country in the Middle East.
Absolutely. But, there's a part in that article that I'd like to read because it was news to me, and I was like, whoa, it's worse than I thought. They had a picture of Mitt Romney with the Jewish Congresswoman Alina Ross-Letnin, who's been a covert agent, it says, of the Israeli government since his graduation from college. Romney and Netanyahu are brothers of the Masonic Lodge, and for years worked side by side in a consulting company in Boston reputed to be an Israeli front organization, and that basically calling him an agent for Israel, and that even Bain Capital as an Israeli front.
Yeah, I believe that because of their friendship, Netanyahu believes that if Romney were elected president, that he could dictate American foreign policy. It appears that this whole business, this whole to-do about the film Innocence of Muslims, was a calculated effort to stir up unrest in the Middle East so that when Netanyahu went on television just a couple of weeks ago, he could talk about the failure of Obama's foreign policy and how rioters are protesting at embassies, where even the shooting of Christopher Stevens appears to have been an arranged event because he was not at an embassy. He was in a CIA safe house where the only persons who would have had knowledge of his whereabouts were those on the inside. So it looks as though even going to that extent of the execution or assassination, perhaps our most talented Arabist, a guy who really knew how to solve problems in that complicated region, was deliberately taken out to make matters more difficult for Obama and to embarrass him politically in a way that would give superficial, fabricated evidence of support for attacks on his failure. His foreign policy is a failure.
Right. Well, it also had listed that one of the Mormon Church's doctrines says that their members are members of the 12 tribes of Israel. So, hello, this isn't Israel. This is America.
It is bizarre. It is bizarre. And I'm glad you mentioned that article. It's entitled, Israel's Netanyahu and the Jewish Neocons in America Vow Revenge. And believe me, when I encountered this stuff, Meria, I was dumbfounded.
Well, it's definitely shocking stuff. Years ago, I learned that, interestingly enough, who was it that put up the money to start two different cults in this United States? One was the Mormon Church. The other was Jehovah's Witnesses. And if you trace the money, shock of all shocks, it was the B'nai B'rith, a Jewish organization. So you have to say, why would a Jewish organization, B'nai B'rith, sponsor, what are supposedly Christian organizations? They're both cults in my book, and I have firsthand experience with the Jehovah's Witnesses. Why would they sponsor Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons? People have to start paying attention and stop believing blindly in all this hogwash and bullshit that's out there, and realize these people want to bring about their own Armageddon, rapture, whatever you want to call it.
Meria, that's right. I mean, it's shocking, but, not only is it the case that not all Jews are Zionists and not all Zionists are Jews, but some of the non-Jew Zionists, these extreme fanatic right-wing evangelicals are praying for an all-out war in the Middle East to bring about the second coming, as you were suggesting before. I mean, it's a bizarre theology. It's one with political consequences, and I'm sorry to say it seems to be having an influence.
Absolutely. Look, I had a report just last month. I don't even know if you and I talked about it, where the evangelicals now have set up live feed cameras in Jerusalem so they can film the second coming of Jesus when it happens. All right, how much crazier and sick is this going to get?
The second coming of Christ. Unbelievable.
Right. And, maybe they'll create a little hologram, or maybe it'll be Big Bird. Anyway, Jim, Jim, we're going to go to a short break, but when we get back, because I have promised people that we are going to talk about FEMA camps, we're going to talk about Homeland Security, who just bought another 750 million hollow point bullets. Who are they going to use those on? So stay with us. Jim and I will be right back.
From a distance, the world looks blue and green, and the snow-capped mountains.
At this point in Earth's history, it's safe to say that we all know it's beyond time to reinvent the wheel. No system on Earth is working anymore, and we see it all collapsing like a deck of cards. You may agree that it's hard to keep your balance and sanity in a world gone mad. You may wonder how I do. Well, it's all in my book, Reinventing the Wheel, the 13 Stones of the Universal Wheel, the tool for global unity. Learn about how I keep happy, healthy, balanced, and focused on a better future for all living things within the pages of a book I was told would become a Bible of future generations. There's never been a time it's been needed more. Reconnect to the soul that lives inside your body. Reconnect to the natural world and be happy again. Become attuned to everything around you, both seen and unseen. The book is available right here on site. Hard copy if you live in the U.S. and ebook format if you live outside the U.S. Something so simple as real spirituality should be. Something that costs you nothing but letting go of old programming and beliefs based on lies. Become a free, fully participating human doing. Order your copy today, right here at Meria.net. You'll be glad you did. Now, back to the show. Okay, welcome back to Roaring Truth. And man, we're roaring today, Jim, and I'm roaring and raring to go.
Well, there's so much going on, Maria, and so much of it is just stupefying. I mean, when you got a corrupt candidate like Mitt Romney, who's also a brainless nitwit, it's really shocking that a serious or presumably serious Republican Party would nominate him. I think it could not be more obvious that this guy is a mere puppet.
Absolutely.
And those pulling the strings are simply finding him useful as a convenient stand-in for the real powers that will be running the country, if indeed they succeed in getting him elected, where they appear to be taking all the measures necessary to steal the election. You know, they talk about vote fraud, Maria, which of course is a one-by-one question about an individual voter voting improperly.
Right, which rarely happens.
Or what have you.
Right.
Well, it turns out not only has vote fraud been virtually non-existent in the country, but a company that the Republicans hired to work in 5 or 6 swing states has just been investigated for vote fraud in Florida because they were registering dead people to vote for the Republicans. And they also have had representatives in malls and so forth selectively signing up, registering to vote persons who were going to vote for Romney. It's really disgusting.
Right. Well, registering dead people will match the candidate, Mr. IKEA, built by IKEA. I don't know that anybody could be any whiter than the Ryan Romney ticket, but that's a story for another day in a country where white is no longer the majority. You have a couple of hot articles out on Homeland Security. on FEMA, where now FEMA is getting ready to pass, or Congress trying to pass H.R. 6566, which I talked about on the show a little the other day, the Mass Fatality Planning and Religious Considerations Act. I don't know which part of that sentence insults me the most, okay? I'm going to tell you this. If we get bombed from one end to the other in this country, if we have a civil war, if the country is on fire, the last thing I'm going to be thinking about is religious considerations. Okay.
Now, it's one of those covers, Meria. You know, they have all these, innocuous sounding names for legislation when the intent is malevolent. They want to create the impression that it's to benefit the American people when it manifestly is not. So you're absolutely correct. Now, Congress is in the process of passing H.R. 6566, the Mass Fatality Planning and Religious Considerations Act, which has even been posted on the government track website for FEMA to mobilize for mass fatality planning. It's mandating federal agencies to respond to funeral homes, cemeteries, and mortuaries for being overwhelmed in the aftermath of a mass terror attack, a natural disaster, or other crisis. It was posted after having been approved by the House on 28 September 2012, not to make an obvious point, but there is no domestic terrorist threat, as a recent study has come from the Senate reveals, and no conceivable natural disaster that could possibly justify this dramatic authorization for coping with staggering numbers of bodies, Meria. And I must say, you know, I was simply staggered to discover that the U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs has a report on 3 October that reveals, quote, despite reviewing 13 months worth of reporting originating from fusion centers from April 1st, 2009 to April 30th, 2010, the subcommittee investigation could identify no reporting which uncovered a terrorist threat, nor could it identify a contribution such fusion center reporting made to disrupt an active terrorist plot. Mm-hmm. And I'm quoting their own finding, which means that there is no evidence of the existence of any domestic terrorist threat. On that basis, it is rational to infer with high probability that there is no domestic terrorist threat. Meria, when you put that together with the fact that there are more than 300 FEMA camps distributed around the country, that Congress has authorized 30,000 drones to conduct surveillance, and that the Department of Homeland Security has requisitioned over $1.5 billion rounds of 40 caliber hollow point ammunition, which is not even permissible for use in warfare under the Geneva Conventions. We have to infer, since the Department of Homeland Security does not conduct operations abroad, that it must be acquiring that massive stock of ammo for use right here in the United States.
Of course. Where else could it be? You know, yesterday I had a report on the Homeland Security and the, another 750 million rounds of high power ammo. But when you talk about the Department of Homeland Security and their fusion centers, I'm trying to locate it while I'm talking to you so I don't give out the wrong figures, because I did it on the show yesterday. What they found were a lot of those fusion centers were non-existent. And there was a congressman, who I think it was, that actually came out and said that all they've ever gotten from the entire DHS is garbage, pure garbage, nothing of use, garbage, but non-existent agencies too, and we're paying for that.
Let me quote from the report. At DHS headquarters, reports officers who reviewed the draft HIRs from fusion centers, these were the terrorist activity reports,
right,
before they were to be published, found many of the reports useless.
Right.
The officers shared those sentiments in written comments they made, recommending that particular HIR draft reports be canceled. At times, they expressed amazement at the poor quality of reporting. Of the 574 unclassified report drafts field officers filed, the subcommittee investigation counted 188, marked by DHS reviewers as canceled, nearly a third. Of the 86 unclassified reports published, the subcommittee found only 94 which related in some ways. That must be 186 found only 94 which related in some way to potential terrorist activity or the activities of known or suspected terrorists. Some were based on information from publicly available websites and dated public reports. Virtually none of them, Maria, contained any information of value.
Right. And then, let's not leave out, one of your articles, and again, there's a link here so people can just click through. Since DHS doesn't conduct operations abroad, it's rational to infer with virtual certainty that they must be acquiring that massive stock of ammo for use in the United States. And it's not just DHS. Now I see that even IRS agents are buying bullets, FEMA buying bullets. There's, I don't know, was it Fish and Game that's also buying bullets?
Yeah, wildlife.
I mean, you look at this and you're saying, what in the hell? What are they expecting? So I'm going to ask you, because you're one of the most intelligent people I know. Do you think that there is going to be some big happening before or after the election, that people are just going to go wild in this country? Because I honestly don't see that we have the guts for an Arab Spring or an American Spring.
Well, I'm very worried, Maria, about the capacity of the American people to respond to the threat that is being posed by our own government. It seems to me impossible any longer to deny that Homeland Security is preparing for a massive civil war to be conducted against the American people. I mean, let me enumerate the premises of the argument. First, the U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs has established that there is no domestic terrorist threat.
Right.
Second, there are 300 or more FEMA camps distributed around the country, and we know that Congress has authorized 30,000 drones for domestic surveillance. Third, since there is no domestic terrorist threat, the domestic surveillance in those FEMA camps are not intended to survey terrorists or to imprison terrorists. Fourth, since those drones in FEMA camps are either intended to survey terrorists or U.S. citizens, it follows that since they are not for terrorists, they are for U.S. citizens. 5, DHS has acquired more than 1.5 billion rounds of .40 caliber hollow point ammunition, which is not even permissible in warfare under the Geneva Conventions. 6, since DHS does not conduct operations abroad, it has been acquired for domestic consumption, and since there are no terrorists, it must be for U.S. citizens. 7, Congress is planning for funeral home cemeteries and mortuaries being overwhelmed from a mass terrorist attack, natural disaster, or other crisis. But 8, there is no domestic terrorist threat and no conceivable natural disaster would justify this dramatic authorization for coping with staggering numbers of bodies. Conclusion: the United States is planning for massive civil war involving massive casualties with the citizens of the United States. Consider the evidence. There's no way around it. That's what's happening. Maria, I say, what can be done? Stock up on arms and ammunition. Prepare for a siege with emergency food supplies and medical necessities. This is an election year. Demand of your senators and congressmen. What the F? What is going on? Ask them, demand it, get some answers. They're making public appearances. Go after them, hammer and tongs. Don't let them get away with this. Ask them about HR 6566 and everything else I've just been describing. This is outrageous.
Hey, I totally agree. So, my thought is, I keep watching the world situation. You got this Turkey and Syria thing going on. We're pissing off China. Suddenly we don't want Chinese businesses in the United States for national security reasons. And you look at Israel still pushing on Iran. You got Mitt Romney like an ape beating his chest. And I'm thinking to myself, which one is going to be the October surprise? Because my thought is if we decide, and we've already said, we're an ally of Turkey with NATO, if we decide to start another war, I think it would be impossible to unseat Obama during another war. And believe me, I'm no fan of Obama either. I guess we should have made that clear at the top of the show. But it just looks to me, some people are saying with Mitt Romney's experience destroying businesses, outsourcing, etc., he might be the right man to fire sale what's left of America.
The right man to fire sale what's left of America.
Well, who knows how to, dissolve businesses and whatnot better than he does? Sell out.
Romney. Yeah, that's stunning. That's stunning. So that might be the rationale for getting him in that position. He knows how to disband businesses, so he would be in a good position to disband the United States.
Exactly. He just fire sale us all to the highest bidder. He doesn't give a shit. His money's offshore. Do you know what I'm saying? The fact that his money's offshore, why didn't they bring that up in the debate? The fact that he's outsourced so many jobs. Jim, I would have given anything to have moderated that debate. Because both of them would have been in a state of shock.
On a bang-up job, Jim Blair was pathetic. I was stunned by the ineptness of his performance. I mean, he added nothing and allowed himself to be steamrollered. And, Romney was rude and abusive, but Blair didn't stick up for himself at all and could have asked very pointed questions that might have made a difference.
Hey, absolutely. I know that I had a million questions and I'm waiting for that 1-2 punch. Never came. So I'm wondering if Obama, because he got so much shit about this debate, if he's going to actually go balls to the wall in the next one, or if he thinks he's still going to take the high road.
Well, I think we're going to see effects, fallout already this week when Joe Biden takes on Paul Ryan. I think that's going to be a knockdown, a real heavyweight slugfest. I mean, Romney and Ryan really want to privatize Social Security and undercut Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, the Ryan budget, which Romney has signed on to, is draconian. I mean, not only does it slash, the tax rates and make the rich richer, it redistributes the burden even to a greater extent on the middle class, and it leaves the poor and the homeless out in the cold. I mean, Romney's Medicare program, his medical policy, Meria, is to send those in need to emergency.
Right, I heard that. Well, you know what the other thing is, and nobody talks about it. I listened to everything he said, and believe me, he truly does hate the poor and would like to see them all dead. I don't know how anybody can't see that. But if I was the moderator, I would have thrown his religion right at him and said, what would Jesus do? Why not use their hiding under the Jesus mantle, which has nothing to do with Mormonism? They adopted that later on. They originally called themselves Luciferians. People need to really learn history. One of the best books to get that handle on this guy is called The God Makers. So here you have a religion that started out as Luciferians, adopted the name Jesus later to make themselves look more palatable to people that are going to follow anything blindly. Some guy tripped on who knows what kind of acid and found these stones, and bingo, the next thing you know, we're all God men and, the rest of that crap. But why didn't they throw the Jesus thing at him? Jesus said to take care of the poor. He said rich would never get into heaven. Why didn't they use his religion the way he uses it for convenience? Why didn't they throw that in his face? I would.
Oh, Meria, the whole thing is so disgusting. I'm just stunned that there were so many ways to go about attacking this guy. The fact that Obama was so passive. I wonder, could he have had something put into his Coke? I mean, what's going on here?
I have no idea. They said maybe without his teleprompter he was lost. But you know what, Jim? I mean, I remember the first president I remember as a kid was Ike Eisenhower.
Yes.
And a lot of people liked Ike. Actually, there was a button like that. A lot of people liked him because he was in the service. And that's another point people are making is neither one of these candidates have ever served their country. It's the first time in 68 years.
Yes.
And these are the people that are going to decide wars and sending other people's kids off to war. So, I don't know how many more elections I can actually live through, Jim. I mean, this one it's hard for me to watch the debates, but I know I have to.
Yes.
But if I force myself, I can only imagine the average American doesn't even think about watching it. They're so numbed down that they're beaten up. They just don't care anymore. Nothing changes except for the worse. Except, of course, I think Romney will be the worst of the worst, without question of a doubt.
Well, I think the questions you raised about Mormonism are perfectly legitimate. I mean, it's a very strange situation we find ourselves in. I mean, where Mormonism has is a relatively recent vintage. I mean, it only emerged in the 19th century, and it seems to be founded on a lot of ideas that most of us would regard as, let us say, bizarre, if not even crackpot.
Fantasy, science fiction. Okay. It makes me wonder in 2012 how people can just believe these fictional stories so easily. I mean, I was hoping when I was a young girl that by the year 2000, we would live on an enlightened, evolved world. But after 2000, I got to tell you, Jim, the shit hit the fan, and it's like we're going back to Neanderthal at the speed of light.
Well, I have the impression that the vision that dominates among Romney's wealthy supporters is medieval. It's a feudal vision where you have these, gated communities that are like, palaces surrounded by moats,
right.
Fortresses, castles on hills surrounded by moats, and everyone else, the rest of the land, the rest of us are all serfs or tilling in the fields. I mean, it's just a stunning vision.
I know, and it's like, the more I read about different Republicans running for office and their religious twisted views, all Muslims should be sent out of the country and children should get the death penalty for disrespecting their parents. Of course, the rest of the world has to be shitting their pants with what's running for office. They're looking at us like, what in the hell is wrong with the American people that they can allow these crazy, everybody sees what has happened to the Republican Party from its original whatever it was. And they're shaking in their boots, and for good reason. I often wonder, why don't we let the rest of the world vote in our elections? Because they have to suffer for it. They suffer for the results.
Well, Maria, it's amazing. I think that this report about fusion centers is supposed to be released tomorrow, according to what I have heard. And, it should create quite a controversy here. I mean, the fact that the American government and Homeland Security have been conducting all these investigations, and they have turned up no evidence of any domestic terrorist threat, none.
Right.
I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
No, let alone the continual steady decrease in major crime throughout the country since 2000. And yet the police force is getting more and more militarized, more and more in your face. We got checkpoints on the road. I mean, what in the hell? And how can Americans sit back and be okay with this? How can anybody be okay with it?
The acquisition of this vast amount of ammunition that I have heard is the claim that by some that they're preparing for, say, a small asteroid or meteor to hit Earth. And then I raised the question, well, so they need that 1.5 billion rounds to shoot all the survivors?
Right. Well, maybe they think they're going to shoot the medias down.
I mean, why wouldn't they warn the country so that, steps could be taken to prepare for an emergency? I mean,
well, Russia is preparing for that meteor. We're not. Because, we have American exceptionalism. If a meteor hits, it'll hit everywhere but America. Don't you know that,
Tell me more
Jen?
about that. You're saying that Russia actually is taking steps because a meteor may, in fact...
Yes, Russia's been working on a program to try to divert or shoot these meteors out of the way because they know there's one due to hit the planet. I don't know what year they said. I think it might be like 2030. They try to get the United States involved, but of course we don't pay attention to anything. So, other countries who are not wasting their money on military expenditures and defense and wars are actually spending their money to develop their own countries, their economy, solar power, fight, meteors or whatnot that may come from outer space. But only America, just concentrates on, what is our budget? It's the Defense Department. That's it. That's all we care about. But if you Google it, you might find those articles. I mean, those are stories I reported quite a while ago, Jim.
Yes, I'm sure you have, Maria. The other alternative is that there's going to be an alien invasion.
Yeah, well, I would assume it'll be some holographic FX like we got on 9/11 for that one.
Yeah, that's what I wonder, Maria. Are they going to,
That's my thought. I mean, they've perfected. They've perfected.
Is that going to be the justification for declaring, military law?
Right. We all have to unite now to fight the aliens together. That's something that's been prophesied for 20 years that they would pull. If the environmental destruction scheme didn't work, they were going to pull out the alien invasion. And sure enough, I don't doubt it.
Well, Obama has signed some 20 executive orders that give him control over all the transportation, all the communication.
Yep.
Virtually every other aspect of American life in the case of an emergency, which he alone can determine to be the state of affairs that obtains.
Right. Hey, he had an emergency in that last debate. He could have called it then. Jim, we're out of time, but I got to tell you, this has been quite the riveting show. For me, I don't know about you, but it's been pretty hot.
My great pleasure, Maria. I always enjoy appearing with you. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, I'm sure next month we're going to have a whole lot to talk about in our November show. So I can barely wait. So you
I'll
take.
Look forward to it, Maria.
All right, you take.
Hold our breath.
No, neither one of us. All right, you take care, Jim, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Maria.
You're welcome. Jim Fetzer, one and only. I'll tell you what, if today's show didn't get you to thinking, then I don't know what will. And listen, if you have a religious belief that actually works for you, that's great. But if you can't see from all the stories I've been saying this past year or two that all religions are being exposed for what they are and what they aren't, then what can I tell you? I've always believed there's a huge difference between spirituality and being religious. And I've always known that I never needed a religion to believe that there's something better than us out there. I'm hoping there is. Anyway, tomorrow, David Icke joins me. I'll see you then.
Thank you for listening and supporting The Meria Show. Tell others what you learned today. Knowledge becomes wisdom only when it's shared. Encourage others to subscribe today. www.meria.net. Often imitated, never duplicated. A world of information all in one place. www.meria.net. Always ahead of the curve. Always on your side. Get active or get radioactive. Subscribe today.